Good evening, everyone. Buonasera, and welcome to Say Venice. I'm Charles Tolbert. I'm president of the board of directors of Say Venice, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. It is an overflow crowd. It is such a popular, we're very intimate here. It's very close. We have an overflow crowd in another room. It's that crowded. I am pleased to welcome you all here this evening for a very special talk on Peggy Guggenheim by the illustrious Dr. Philip Rylands. So this lecture is being live streamed. It's so popular, we're simulcast. And it's going to be available as a recorded video later, so you can tune in later. I'd like to start by thanking the Italian Cultural Institute and Melina Manarino for hosting us this evening. We're really grateful for this partnership with the Italian Cultural Institute. And thank you all to the members of Say Venice. You've been so generous, and your generosity and your donations go so far in funding our mission. For those people who are not members yet, we have our staff, Amy, Chris, and Araby, who will be in the lobby with brochures and can tell you all about membership. And if you're already a member and want to find out about other levels of membership and other benefits and perks, we have those things available as well. So some calendar items. On May 19th, all Say Venice supporters are invited to virtually join the Roseanne Library and Studies Center's webinar, Explorientitions Assunta, a new interactive website. That is going to launch as an interactive online tool, and it gives an unparalleled overview of the conservation of Titian's Assunta at the Frari. Then mark your calendar for June 14th. Members may join a tour of the exhibition Artemisia Gentileschi's Strong Women at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and that is being led by board member, senior curator of paintings, Dr. Davide Gasparotto. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Philip Rylands. If I tried to give his full bio, it would rival another lecture. So the short version of the bio is he earned his Ph.D. from Cambridge University and is currently the president and CEO of the Society of the Four Arts in Palm Beach. He's also an honorary director of the Say Venice board. From 1979 to 2017, he managed and directed the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, of which he is now director emeritus. Throughout his long career, he has curated exhibitions, taught at several universities, and has written a number of publications on Venice, including books on the Church of the Madonna dell'Orto in Venice, Palm Vecchio, the history of the Venice Biennale, and on Peggy Guggenheim. What an honor it is for me to welcome Dr. Philip Rylands.
Some years ago, I gave a lecture called Peggy Guggenheim and New York for Say Venice. This is called Peggy Guggenheim and Venice, so it's a similar lecture. I focused the early part a little more, and it's skewed towards Venice. I think that's the point. I hope I can tell you some things which you don't already know about Venice. The Peggy's museum, and I think it's worth remembering this, Peggy's collection belongs to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. We all know that. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation also opened in the 1990s the Guggenheim Bilbao, and will open one of these days the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. But the first in that sequence is Peggy's collection. And when she gave it, and I'm going to end the lecture on precisely on that topic, she unwittingly created the first museum organization on two continents. And she set the pattern for a notorious, in the positive sense, strategy in the 1990s, on the part of a certain Thomas Krenz to create a new model for museums, international, polycentric, and so forth. But Peggy, when she insisted that her collection stay in Venice, created that premise. And it actually rather literally started from there, but that's not the lecture I'm going to give this evening. I've got an awful lot of slides. I'm going to have to move a little bit fast. There's Peggy looking absolutely her best with Calder earrings. And I'll just glance through her collection. That's the first chunk of the show, just to remind you why she's considered so wonderful. Actually, there are many reasons, but one of them the most palpable is that of her collection. There's the earliest work in her collection, Picasso's Poet, 1911, and another Picasso, the magical, rather monstrous girls with a toy boat on a beach. Electrifying also because it was painted only weeks before the bombing of Guernica, and the admittedly strange serenity of this picture, so much in contrast with the mural by Picasso that followed. I have to keep going. One of the more fun pictures in the collection is Metzinger's Racing Cyclist. It's a piece of newscasting. This character, Charles Croupilant, his name is actually on a piece of papier collé, won the Paris-Roubaix race in 1912, and this is he chasing somebody ahead whom he's about to overtake in the stadium of Roubaix. It's still a famous race called the Race from Hell because it's done over cobblestones for about 2/3 of the way, I think I'm right. And this piece of rather emphatic simultaneity in all kinds of ways, this implication of time within the painting, this implication, this effort to get on painting two things which you can't normally see, speed and time, is characteristic of the intellectual flavor of Cubism in 1912. It's a very good picture, his masterpiece, and always been a favorite. When we did a show about it, we merchandised a tie, and I'm wearing it right now with bicycles on it. And a great Leger on the right, couldn't be omitted from any collection of Cubism. Peggy's Kandinsky, an early Bavarian work. She has 3. And a Mondrian, which she bought from Herbert Reed, we'll meet him later, buy from his studio when he was living in London, along with artists like Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth, a group, a wonderful community moment in Hampstead that Herbert Reed characterized as a nest of gentle artists. Well, that was one of his rare London paintings. And in this context, I might alert you to something which you can figure out later. The compositional devices are very similar to that of Carpaccio's Vision of St. Augustine, recently restored by, say, Venice. But you can figure that out later. But it shows, it helps you to understand that both works are classical in their own way. Suprematism represented by Malevich, metaphysical art by De Chirico. Peggy's 3 De Chiricos are the best on public display in Italy. There's something, even with Italian museums. She has 3 really good ones from the right period, the early period of metaphysical art. It's actually called Nostalgia of the Poet, a homage to Apollinaire. A beautiful, magical Paul Klee, as he called a magic garden. It's about a fantasy of a child playing in his garden. And a somber Miro, a homage to Spain, painted only days after the fall of Barcelona at the end of the Spanish Civil War. So very great Miro. 2 perfect Max Ernst. These are masterpieces. The one, 1927, called The Kiss, is from that automatist period of surrealism. The one on the right, The Attirement of the Bride, 1940-41, I think, from the more dreamlike character of later surrealism. So 2 perfect works of art to represent surrealism, which is such a strength in her collection. And it must be said, in parenthesis, that when she gave her collection to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, it filled an enormous gap in the Guggenheim collection's surrealism, basically, and so on. Here's a picture you might have seen lately in the art press. Ken Griffin of Palm Beach bought this for a cute $120 million. And I took the liberty of sending him my catalogue entry for this particular painting, which we saw together many years ago when he was a much younger man and probably not quite as rich. Magritte's Empire of Light. Peggy bought it in '54. I'm mentioning this also because he bought it from the Biennale, so it has a Venetian note. The '54 Venice Biennale was dedicated above all to surrealism, and Peggy's son, Sinbad, was reported to have come back from the Biennale and said, Mama, there's this wonderful painting, you have to buy it. She didn't want to buy it out of the Biennale because it meant paying the Biennale commission. But luckily she did, because there was a queue of collectors waiting to buy it at the end of the Biennale, and she got it first. And it is probably the finest, George Melly said this, the critic, probably the finest in a series of, I think, well over 12 paintings of this theme, the Empire of Light. And she also bought sculpture, bought that from her friend Brancusi in 1940 on the left. She bought the scary Giacometti on the upper right from Giacometti, and it turned out to be, this is one of, I'll use the word unwitting more than once, I hope, because Peggy unwittingly created opportunities for people. Giacometti was too poor to have bronze casts made. Peggy found a sort of wrecked plaster and said, will you cast this for me? He said, no, but I'll do a better one for you. And came up with this woman with her throat cut, La Femme Égorgée, considered by David Sylvester, sorry, that's my voice over there. David Sylvester, of all people, Giacometti's finest surrealist work. And it's the #1 bronze in his oeuvre. When I would take people around, I would characterize it as a blend of orgasm and rigor mortis. Sorry, going back, that again, Peggy in Venice, one of the things I want you to understand is that Peggy went on collecting and how after she moved to Venice in the late 1940s. And she bought that in 1947, the collage sculpture, the assemblage really, a very modern looking Boccioni of 1915. It's the only sculpture that exists on which Boccioni placed his own hands. It's the only sculpture which represents the manifesto that Boccioni wrote of sculpture. We're talking about futurism. So it's actually a uniquely important work. It's very damaged. It was sort of redone by Marinetti's widow in the 1940s. But it is, there it is. Peggy has it, and she was very smart to buy it at a time when futurism was not fashionable. The only sculpture by Boccioni. All the others you see are posthumous casts, so pay no attention to them. So moving on from the collection, Peggy was a Guggenheim after all. And I'm not quite sure can I use this? Does this have any effect? No, it doesn't, the cursor. Peggy's father, Benjamin, is on the extreme left. Right in the middle is the patriarch of the Guggenheims, Mayer, who at 19 years old in 1848 sailed penniless across the Atlantic, set up their place in Pennsylvania, sort of shop, I think. They were peddlers at first. And from 1881, Mayer made an amazing fortune when he bought two, what seemed like worked out mines in Leadville, Colorado, the AY and the Mini, and was their names. They were flooded and so on, and it was a bonanza, the first of many bonanzas. And the short story is that by 1915, the Guggenheims were estimated to own 75% of the world's known resources in silver, copper, and lead. And this is the family that Peggy came from. Solomon is sitting at the table with walrus moustaches. That's Peggy's uncle. And standing at Mayer's left is Dan Guggenheim. His son, Harry, will appear later in the lecture. Peggy with her two siblings. Peg is the seated one, Hazel. Poor Hazel, was unhappy much of her life, possibly a little mentally unstable. I don't mean to insult her, but the family claimed that it was because Benjamin Guggenheim, her father and Peggy's, wanted to be at her second birthday in New York, that he changed his transatlantic crossing ship at the last minute, the Titanic, and that was the end of Benjamin Guggenheim. You know, part of Peggy legend is that her father died heroically in April 1912 on the RMS Titanic. And there's Peggy in 1903, we think, painted by Franz von Lehnbach. Amazing that the portraitist of Bismarck and the Middle European aristocracy also painted Peggy. It shows that Benjamin took her to Europe, and probably as a very small child she already acquired a habit, the pleasure of being in Europe, even at that time. There's a paintings that and there's another that she used to have in her bedroom in Venice. There are other stories I could tell, but I will refrain. We'll jump now to the second main episode of Peggy's life, which is that when she's in England for much of the late 20s and 30s. She, in 1938, resolves that rather than being, as she put it, a wife or a mistress in all those years, she'd do something more worthwhile and either have a publishing house or a contemporary art gallery. Samuel Beckett, her lover at the time, convinced that it should be contemporary art as it was a living thing. And the coin, when she tossed it, fell in favor of a contemporary art gallery. So for roughly 18 months, she runs on Cork Street, London, a gallery called Guggenheim Jeune, and it's made a big impact on London. She was a neophyte, though she learned fast Humphrey Jennings, another short-term lover, took her around the 1937 Paris exposition. They saw Calder, they saw Miro, they saw the Guernica. She moved to Cork Street, where already two galleries were dealing in contemporary European art, the Mayer and the London Gallery. And she sets off on this adventure, gives a show to Cocteau, and in a second we'll see her second show dedicated to Kandinsky. But this one in particular caused a scandal in London. She imported Marcel Duchamp, old friend and advisor. Marcel Duchamp, she said, taught her the difference between abstraction and surrealism. Because in the late 1930s, in the 1930s as a whole, what you had to know if you weren't going to be in the know was the difference between the two, because they were the two main currents. And somebody like Herbert Reed, Peggy's soon-to-be friend, claimed that they represented the only two ways forward in contemporary art of that time. And I'll go back to the talk about her collection. The fact that there's abstraction and surrealism, not to speak of cubism, in her collection is, I think, almost unique among collectors at the time, where people either bought one or they bought the other. But Peggy wanted to represent the history of 20th century art, and that's what she did. So she has this little show of sculpture. These two works were in it, an ARP, which the first work she ever bought, and the beautiful Henry Moore, a miniature version of a sculpture now on a huge scale in the park at Much Haddam, where the Moore Foundation is. To import these sculptures, she wanted to avoid paying import tax. Fair enough. They were works of art. But in order to do that, she had to get them certified by the director of the Tate Gallery. And he was reported in the tabloids making remarks like, "This plays havoc with our youth. We should keep it out of this country. And if anyone believes that an ostrich egg is the beginning of the birth of the world, should have their head examined." So she talked about a Brancusi. This is a man called J.B. Manson. We're going to meet him later. But the abusive response to this and the refusal to let her off, I think she finally got permission by having Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland people write to the Houses of Parliament and so on. So she eventually got the exemption, which she thought she should have on a matter of principle. And she took some of the credit when J.B. Manson was fired a few months later. There was another reason for that, that's the sort of vitality with which Peggy came about the art. The second show, the first show was Cocteau, the fourth was the sculpture. The second show was dedicated to Kandinsky. Duchamp introduced her to Kandinsky at a distance. He was living in Paris at the time. And she made a wonderful show, curated, I think, really by Kandinsky and Duchamp together. And she bought, amazingly, the picture on the lower right. Dominant Curve is Kandinsky's masterpiece by his own affirmation of his Paris period. 1936 is the date of it, the third of his periods. Yes, I think the third. So she bought an absolutely amazing work of art. So if you ever see a film done by Lisa Vreeland about Peggy Guggenheim, in it you'll see a certain person who I suppose I won't name, but anyway, he rather pompously says, "Oh, and Peggy didn't know anything about art at the beginning. She made lots of mistakes and she had to learn later." Well, you know, we've seen a beautiful little ARP. There was a wonderful Delvaux she just bought. I'll mention, we may see that later. And she buys this masterpiece. She was sad. Somebody convinced her to let it go. They said, "This is a fascist painting or Nazi painting." And it may be that it was simply because Kandinsky was still living in Paris during the occupation. And one could figure out other reasons for this. But nonetheless, she was deceived into selling it. It ended up in the hands of Karl Nierendorf, the great German dealer. And when he died, Leo Castelli arranged for the dispersal of the gallery inventory, including this, and it went entire, the gallery inventory, to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, something which didn't give Peggy a lot of pleasure. I'll say why in a second. So the picture on the upper left is not in the Peggy's collection either. She convinced her sister, Hazel, the little one whose birthday party was so tragic for Benjamin, to offer it as a gift to the Tate Gallery. This was sometime after the fiasco with the importation block on the sculpture. It came much later. But the Tate Gallery did, persuaded by John Rothenstein, who's a better director of the Tate than J.B. Manson was, to accept the gift, which they did on the condition they didn't have to exhibit it. so it was the most advanced picture that the Tate had at the time, and still today figures as it rectifies a little the weakness of the Tate Gallery's collections in historic modernism. So that was that. As slowly as she did her series of exhibitions, surrealism begins to emerge. She does a show for a Dane called Rita Kern Larsen, and in July 1938 she gives a really successful show, the only really successful show she had, with her new lover, Yves Tanguy. Again, unwittingly, Peggy, by having an affair with Tanguy and separating him from his wife, made it possible for him later to marry Kay Sage. Kay Sage then took him to America, and that's why Yves Tanguy counts in the Whitney Museum of American Art. But there he is. He was a wonderful guy, a sort of peasant-like type from Normandy, simple soul. And Peggy bought the picture on the left at the time of the show. And that's how she starts making her collection. Often it was because she didn't want to disappoint her artists, who, because there were so few sales, so she'd anonymously buy things and they'd slip into her collection. And the Tanguy was one of them. There it is again, behind Herbert Reed and Peggy. Just at a closing party, at a party at the end of Guggenheim Schön, the name of the gallery, June 1939. Herbert Reed had met Peggy when he offered to review the Kandinsky show. It didn't happen because nobody wanted to publish anything about somebody weird like Kandinsky, the listener in particular. But she became friends with Herbert Reed. He was then editor of the Burlington magazine. I think we would characterize him as a rather stuffy, old-fashioned art critic and art historian, but a leading figure in the culture of the 1930s and very much open to modern art. And he had years earlier an idea of creating in Edinburgh, of all places, a museum of contemporary art. What was clear to them both was that London really lacked a venue for contemporary art. Should it be the Tate? Should it be some other museum and so on? Peggy planned, in the fall of 1939, a museum of contemporary art using a list that Herbert Reed drew up for her. The list is now, alas, vanished. And Peggy wrote in her droll manner, Herbert made this wonderful list. We had both agreed to start with Cubism and classic modernism in the 20th century, but Herbert kept lapsing into people like Matisse and Van Gogh and Cézanne. She didn't want any of that. She only wanted 20th century art. And in fact, as we shall see, her catalogue, the catalogue of her collection and her gallery in New York come to be known as Art of This Century. Marcel Duchamp is there because, as I mentioned, he was Peggy's great tutor. Marcel Duchamp had a kind of avocation forming collections. Think of the Arensbergs in Philadelphia, but then there was Hans-Pierre Roche as well, and so forth. And Peggy was in that club, so to speak. The museum is rendered impossible by the outbreak of the World War in September 1939. This releases a lot of money from her budget to start buying swathes of new art, which she did energetically in London and Paris. We talked about the Mondrian just now, but also in Paris she started acquiring works by Brancusi and so on. She suddenly had cash to really go seriously at her collection. She flees back to the United States in July 1941, together with, as she again drolly said, her future husband and her former husband together. There was Lawrence Vail, who we're going to meet shortly, her first husband, and Max Ernst, the artist who was her second husband, who she would eventually marry. Again, she's funny about these things. She said, after Pearl Harbor, I thought I shouldn't be living in sin with an enemy alien anymore. I better marry him. So this is typical of Peggy. There's the address. The building is still there. The medium height building is 30 West 57th Street, and the top two spaces with sort of relatively rectangular windows just above those two shallow arches. That's the space that she converted into her museum gallery. She wasn't allowed to do it in her house. We'll see her house shortly. But for the time being, she was busy making a catalogue. Max Ernst was living with her, obviously, at this time. Made that beautiful drawing on the cover of her yellow catalogue. André Breton edited the catalogue for her. She said he went around saying it was catastrophique. It was typical talk there. catastrophique. And Breton said, well, why did you fix it, André? And so André makes it into a kind of anthology of modern art. It's a very, very interesting catalogue. It does one thing which I think is remarkable. In it is translated for the first time André Breton's definition, because he wrote for the catalogue, of automatism. The Americans, they all knew about surrealism. They'd seen, read Minotaur, probably rather badly because it was in French after all. But they knew about surrealism, but this was the first time that an English translation had appeared in print. So Peggy does these things. She didn't ask Breton to do that, but it happens because she made things happen. I think she's walking her dogs somewhere in New York, right there. Her beautiful little dogs. In February 1942, she writes to somebody recommended to her, she was great on recommendations, by Marcel Duchamp, Friedrich Kiesler. Friedrich Kiesler was Romanian, and in 1926 in Vienna, he did a very avant-garde installation of art in which his goal was to attempt to break down the barriers between the realities of art, painted, fictive or whatever, and the realities which we breathe and stand in, to sort of break down that barrier. He called it the communicativeness of art, depended on somehow merging the work of art with your own sense of the physical world around you. Before we move on, that is a beautiful drawing in the Angers style by Achille Gorky, who was a wonderful draftsman, and Kiesler there smoking in front of a painting by Elion. Elion, around about this time, became Peggy's son-in-law. She'd met him back in 1939, I think, on her buying spree in Paris. She'd made a friend of a certain Nelly van Doesburg, the widow of Theo van Doesburg of the style movement. And Nelly said, oh, you must get some of this and that and so on. She wanted a picture by Elion. And Nelly said, well, he's stationed in the army just outside Paris. So that he flew into Paris and they rushed around looking for something. But Peggy, he was supposed to have been so thrilled to see so feminine, so brilliant Nelly and Peggy together that he said, with all your makeup, I haven't seen paintings for so long. He said, in a sort of, he charmed charmed them completely in this way. That's an Elion behind. It's very similar to one that's in the Peggy Guggenheim collection now. So architecturally, I think it's probable that, once again, the unwitting Peggy commissions from Kiesler, giving him virtually a free hand to do anything he liked. He created his most important work, which was the installation of the art in Art of this Century. The name she gave the gallery derived from the name of her yellow catalogue. 3 rooms were dedicated to this and that, but 2 in particular illustrated that contrast between abstraction and surrealism that I spoke of before. And this is his abstract and surreal cubist room. The pictures are taken off the wall and hung in space on cords or ropes. This biomorphic furniture, part of it actually physically made by the energetic Kiesler. It was not easy. There was no labor and no supplies in 1942 at the height of the war. The canvas walls were painted blue. The floor was painted blue. So he created this kind of atmosphere of ill-defined space in which the floor and the walls sort of merge in an undulating way, and it's the kind of space in which abstract forms typically float. I mean, I assumed that was his idea. What Peggy and Elion Kiesler agreed upon was that there should be no frames. And if you think about it, the frame on a painting is that which clearly denotes where you stop and the painting begins. It's the threshold, physical and symbolic and optical or whatever, between you and the reality in the painting. Take off the frames and you help to create this sense of communicativeness, as I say, that Kiesler was aiming for. So he carries out his 1926 ambition, finally, thanks to Peggy, during wartime New York. The surrealist space with curved walls, again the pictures thrust away from the walls, on arms, and actually in some of his drawings they actually are arms, as if the work of art is being held by a hand sticking out of the wall. The ceiling is lowered, the walls are curved. Notoriously, the lights kept flickering on and off in a most alarming manner. A wire recording of an express train occasionally seemed to run right through the gallery. So this disorientation, terror, fear, alarm are typical surrealist provocations. And I don't know, I have no authority for saying this, but it seems to evoke calls in the 1930s by surrealist architects for inter-uterine architecture. Think about that. Peggy's opening, at which she had a beautiful white dress. I think we're going to see it later, and she wore it on another occasion. She wore two different earrings, again, quirky Peggy. One by Yves Tanguy, to denote surrealism, and the other by Alexander Calder to denote the abstract and surrealist, cubist movement. So she wanted to indicate her impartiality between the two movements when she did this. And some years ago, we finally did a recreation. Since the building existed, it was possible to attempt a recreation of what it all looks like. On the right, in blue, is the cubist and abstract room. The darker room north of it, you might say, is probably west, actually, the surrealist room. And then in the front, two plain white cubes overlooking 57th Street that they called the Daylight Gallery for obvious reasons. There was no other daylight in the place. And that recreation shows the first exhibition, her first exhibition of Jackson Pollock. It was her selling gallery. She'd been persuaded to do this by friends who said, if you have a selling gallery, you can help to fund the operation of your museum. So we typically call this a museum gallery. This, in the very early years in New York, 41, 42, 43, that's the ambience in which Peggy lived, the social ambience. All those artists depicted there in the double-height drawing room of her Beekman Place mansion. They're all her friends. I trust you can read their names. I won't go on about them, but that's the world. It includes Kiesler right in the front there, sitting next to Leonora, the beautiful Leonora Carrington. That's the world she lived in. Then she meets Howard Putzel. Actually, she'd met Howard Putzel, up here on the left, already in Paris. Howard Putzel had flown over from San Francisco, where he'd been a prescient dealer in surrealism, and he'd been one of the people who would bring paintings to Peggy even while she was in bed and say, you must buy this, you must buy this. Everyone was pressing her to buy things in the period of months immediately before and during the early months of the Second World War. So Howard Putzel was an old friend. They see each other again in New York. This is the only likeness I've ever been able to find by him, and I persuaded the artist Charles Seliger to give it to us. It was what was used when they were casting the film of Pollock, and they showed a rather corpulent, I think he may have been a moustache, but anyway, he had a bow tie and so on. He looked like what you'd imagine a central casting art critic would look like. And Howard Putzel advises Peggy, especially from the winter of 42-43. What he does is he turns her around. She's looking at Europe in the past. He says, no, look to the young Americans in the future, because he himself had decided on this. It's the same swivel that Leo Castelli does in 1959 when he opens his gallery. He stops dealing in the modern old masters and decides only to deal in new talent. And Howard Putzel does that for Peggy. So he convinces her to go and meet Jackson Pollock. It was a disastrous meeting. He was drunk, he was late, she was irritated. Imagine two completely different worlds. I mean, a cold water, flat, bohemian, impoverished artist on the one hand, often drunk, and that's not an abuse, it's a fact from 1937 onwards. And Peggy, high society, rich, and so on, at least from their perception. But he brought them together. He convinced Peggy to allow Pollock to submit for a juried salon show in the spring of 43, and the jury included Mondrian. I'm going as fast as I can because there's much more I can say, but Mondrian, there he is, one of the jury, came first with punctuality that you'd expect, and stood in front of the Pollock and said, Peggy, she went up to him and said, Pollock has problems and painting is one of them. she hadn't yet got it. And Mondrian said something phonic like, Mrs. Guggenheim, I think this is the most energetic painting I've seen in decades, or in America or something. He really praised it highly and was still looking at it later when she came up to him and was convinced of it. So it's Mondrian, according to a story by young Jimmy Ernst, Max Ernst's son by his first marriage, who was secretary of the gallery at this point. Jimmy Ernst tells this charming story and lots of others. His great autobiography called A Not So Still Life, which I thoroughly recommend. That's the painting that he was looking at, and it is a pretty awful painting. I mean, you can understand Peggy's position on it. It's a sort of pseudo-Matisse reclining figure, or a cat stretching in the sun, or something's going on. Or others say it's two figures standing at a table. There's weird kind of crisscrosses and numbers on it. It looks like a very incompetent painting. If you think of Pollock, if you don't know who Pollock is, you met him once and he was tight. But she accepts it, and the salon is a success, and she decides that Pollock will be the champion of her gallery. She puts him on a contract in July, releases him from his manual labor at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, of all places, and commissions from him a mural. Do I have it here? Yes, there it is. For her apartment at 155 East 61st Street, no longer existing, alas, but in her apartment she wanted something to decorate the hallway. And Kirk Varnedoe, the great MoMA critic, he speculated that one of the reasons that it took so long for Jackson Pollock to get this done was that he wasn't quite sure he was supposed to be, as a great artist, as a Nietzschean artist, painting murals for rich people on 61st Street. But he did in the end. He painted it very fast, not in the 3 hours that Peggy, or the overnight that Peggy speculated. But you'll see it in the film of Pollock, where, what his name is, Ed Harris, spectacularly goes at this huge blank canvas. There it is on the left, with Pollock, lean and hungry look, standing in front of it, not knowing how to tackle anything so large. It is the largest painting ever made, and he just got it done before his first one-man show in November 1943. Not for the show, it couldn't be moved out of it couldn't fit up the elevator, at Art of the Century, but people could go and see it at her apartment. And its fame has spread. What can I say about it? There she is, Pollock, looking a little more prosperous with his tight button jacket in front of her, now that Peggy's been paying him monthly for several months. But there it is. It's accrued all kinds of legends around him. And the great David Anfam, who alas died not so long ago, the great British authority on abstract expressionism, said that there's a good argument for this being the equivalent of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso for American art. It was a real icebreaker. That's actually the word he uses. It's a phrase that de Kooning uses, but I don't know whether he was thinking of the mural or not. It eventually went to the University of Iowa, and I've been speculating how that would happen. Somebody once told me that Peggy's older sister, who calamitously died in the 1920s, she was devoted to her, was married briefly to the postmaster of Iowa City, but that's not good enough, really. And I think the picture could have gone anywhere. MoMA showed it in 1947 next to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in a show called Big Pictures. Yale had it on loan for 6 months, but they couldn't get rid of it fast enough. So I'm telling you that it's clumsy and awkward to move around. I have a photograph on my iPhone of it flying over the Grand Canal in a crate when we brought it to Venice once. A huge painting, 25 feet long. And then she was obviously charmed by a man called Lester Longman. Lester Longman had been made the head of the art faculty at the University of Iowa in 1936, in succession to, of all people, Grant Wood. And Lester Longman probably enthused her about the picture and was so keen to have it that she submitted to he was about the same age, actually, he was in his 40s. But Lester Longman, I think, should be given the credit for this achievement. And therefore you see it. I found that photograph only the other day in the art room of the School of Art of the University of Iowa, hanging high up on the wall. Peggy in 1959 was told, probably wrongly, that it was really hanging in the students' dining room, and it was very disrespectful to this great work. And she tried to get it back. She said, I gave it to you, you can give it back to me. At that point they realized what they had, and now of course it's one of the great works in the Art Museum of the University of Iowa. And when they cleaned it at the Getty a few years ago, they did not find pizza sauce on it or anything of that kind. So while Peggy was supporting Pollock over 4.5 years, over 5 seasons at Art of the Century Gallery, 4 exhibitions and many inclusions in group shows, he went from the Moon Woman on the left, 1942, still a rather tormented Picasso-like or Miro-like thing, based, as was typical in the early 40s, on myth-making, on the myths of the ancient world, or in this case of the indigenous Americans. from that to the drip paintings in 47. Both of those are still in the collection in New York. So that really, with this photograph, I want to suggest that impact, above all on Pollock, but on the whole of the New York school in the 1940s, was huge through her gallery Art of the Century, and thanks also to the alarmingly avant-garde installation by Frederick Kiesler. It was the best place to see contemporary art in New York at that time. And that photograph shows you many artists who were given their first one-man shows, or at least given one-man shows in New York by Peggy. I think almost all of them, one time or another, were exhibited by her. Barnett Newman didn't really get going until 1949-50, and that was too late for Peggy. But that's a famous photograph about which an entire lecture could also be delivered, called The Irascibles. And that helped to identify, to coalesce the American artist as a group. So now we do finally come to Peggy and Venice. She'd thought about going to Venice in 1946. In fact, I'll say more. She resolved to live in Venice as early as 1946 on a train journey to Venice with Mary McCarthy and her new husband, Broadwater Bowden. And so she'd already, before closing Art of the Century in 47, she'd already decided Venice was where she wanted to be. Before we come to that, she was invited to show at the 48 Venice Biennale, the first post-war Biennale. This was probably thanks to the first friend she made in Venice, a painter called Giuseppe Santomaso. We'll see a picture of him later. And Santomaso suggested to the Biennale, to Rodolfo Pallucchini, you should really take Peggy's collection. He was cautious. The Commission for Figurative Arts, as it was called, very inauspicious name, Figurative Arts, was very cautious. Giorgio Morandi thought it was a very bad idea. Roberto Longhi was horrified, and so on. But nonetheless, the collection was shown at the Venice Biennale in the Greek pavilion, which was empty owing to the Greek Civil War. And there are 3 photographs, her welcoming the President of Italy, being slightly intimidated by a relatively minor Italian painter, Arturo Tosi of the Strapaesi movement, and then having fun with the great Leonello Venturi. Those are nice photographs of Peggy. Berenson came around. She was visited by Berenson, and Berenson made it quite clear that he was horrified by sex in art. And figures with holes in their stomachs or whatever. But sex in art was his big issue, which is something coming from the man who sold The Rape of Europa to Isabella Stewart Gardner. But anyway, Berenson said, "You should have gone in for old masters, my dear. I would have got you some bargains," is what he said. She had a memorable visit by Bernard Berenson. So here's a brand new slide for me in any of these talks I've done. Why did Peggy come to Venice? She married in 1921, I think, or 22, Lawrence Vail. Lawrence Vail's father, Eugène Vail, Eugène, not Eugene, was, I think, had an American father and a French mother, lived in Paris, was a successful painter in his own right, won a gold medal at the 1889 Paris exhibition, the very one at which the Tour Eiffel was built, was constructed. So Lawrence, growing up in Paris with his father and making frequent trips to Venice, became like one of those people we all know who really know Venice, you know, where the gelateria is and how to get from one place to another by the shortest route, all those things which we feel we own when we go to Venice. He had it. So in 1926, I think, Peggy and he go to Venice, and already they plot to live there. Peggy starts to buy some furniture. Some of it is still on display in the house. But she had a plan already in 1926 to live in Venice. It doesn't happen, but nonetheless, she goes on. There's Mary McCarthy, whom I mentioned earlier, and there's the beautiful Lawrence Vail, who is very important to Peggy, because when she married him in Paris, he introduced her to the bohemian circles in which she then thrived. There's a funny, I'll go back for a second, there's a funny remark she makes. When she meets Lawrence Vail, she was working at the Sunwise Turn bookshop, which has its own place in the history of bohemian culture in New York, near Grand Central Station. And she said then, it was so wonderful, I felt so alive. All the people around me were so human and intelligent and interesting. And it was as if, and with that phrase, she was kind of rejecting her whole synagogue past, with all her elderly aunts having tea parties in Upper East Side. So her whole Jewish thing, which is very strong in her upbringing, was sort of rejected with that moment when she was released into bohemian life and met Lawrence Vail first in New York and then later when she goes to Europe. So in 1949, she actually buys a house. For the first 2 or 3 years were difficult. She was traveling around, she was looking for the house. She stayed for a while in Palazzo Barbaro, that we all know, and I think irritated, what was her name? The doyenne of the Barbaro family when we arrived in Venice, I forget now. But she still remembered how bothered she was by having somebody as extravagant as Peggy as a tenant. On the upper floor, the very floor where Henry James had his library and his bed and so on. So that put her in a tradition. The Palazzo Venier de Leoni was completely unfinished palace. She was lucky to get it. I'll tell you who she got it from in a second. But it should have been a much bigger building. Look at that. We have a distinguished architect from Palm Beach, New York, behind us here. I think he'll be surprised to see anything so classical on that scale being built in Dorso Duro. The building was designed in 47, I think, by Lorenzo Boschetto. Have I given it? 1749, I've said. And then a model was made later in the 1750s by Domenico Rizzo, which is the model you see there. And if it had ever been built, it would have been that huge thing mirroring the Palazzo Corner opposite. So it's actually would have been an amazing building, but towering over its neighbors. Let me move on. I found that slide of a Canaletto, and I forget where it's from. But in that, if you look to the left, on the left side of the Grand Canal, the bright light is what we know as Campo San Vio. And a bit further towards us, in fact, right at the front of the picture plane is a little Gothic palace, which was also called Palazzo Venier. And the sort of tumble of the rambling little houses with towers in between those two buildings. What's now it's not the Chini Palace anyway. The spaces, you can see there's what the Venier family, only a few years later, decided to build on that site. And that enables you also to see Ca Corner opposite, which is where that triple arch comes from, which puts Peggy's house in an ancestry that goes back to Palazzo Te and Mantua, of all things. But Sansovino's masterpiece is on the right, and Boschetti's megalomaniac, the Venier were the ones who seem to have a lot of money. Why it didn't happen is not well known, but a group of architects from Wake Forest University figured out that the Venier Palace, the reason I pointed it out, the little Gothic palace right at the front on the left-hand side, had to be torn down in the 1820s with structural cracks. And what's possible is the humongous foundations that were laid for this 4 or 5 story palace next door did actually move the earth to the point where the neighboring palace began to crack and fall, and you know, all neighbors quarrel in Venice, so this one was a big one, I assume, and ended badly for little Palazzo Venier. So that may be why it was never finished, this bunker-like palace that Peggy had. So unfinished was it that's on the lower left. You see what it looked like in the 1930s. In the early 90s, it has its own celebrity, this bunker-like palace, Palazzo Venier. There's a rather good book called The Unfinished Palazzo, which narrates in 3 long chapters the 3 women who owned the palace. And one of them was Luisa Casati, doyenne, or muse of Gabriele D'Annunzio, portrayed, she claimed, over 200 times by modern and other artists, Trubetskoy and Man Ray and Baller and all kinds of people. Famous portraits by Baldini. She was, I think, the only person whom Baldini painted twice, which is something. She became poorer and poorer, and in the 1920s it had to move on. She was only renting anywhere, and I think she was only renting in the garden. I think she used the garden, it was one lot, the whole original vast lot of Palazzo Venier was still one lot. It's now been divided, and she was living at the back and then used the garden for her parties, white peacocks, that sort of thing, according to D'Annunzio. In 1936, Doris Castleross buys it. Doris de la Vigne. She was a celebrity in her own way. And in this book, and I'll try to remember the author, The Unfinished Palazzo, she describes herself as a professional mistress. So she's fully in the tradition of the great Venetian courtesans. And she counted some great figures among us. She did get to marry Viscount Castleross, who was absolutely dotty about her, but whom she treated badly because she was having affairs all over the place. And the ones that spring to mind are Cecil Beaton, Randolph Churchill and Winston Churchill. She dies tragically in 42. She never really lived there, but she did pay to have it fixed up. A Venetian architect or geometer or someone did fix it up with permission from the town as a place where you could live. And the building you see now is basically the accomplishment of Doris Castle-Ross. And she dies, we don't know why. People argue that if the scandal of her and Winston Churchill had come out during the height of the war effort, that would not have been good, and perhaps it was better if she was silenced forever, something of that kind. This took place in the Dorchester Hotel in London. Peggy buys the palace, I think already furnished. And immediately, the Biennale is over. She's still got her collection around, and I'll come to that in a second. She immediately does a show of contemporary sculpture. She curates it herself. She goes to meet Marino Marini. She takes a fancy to a Cavaliere, to this rider in Marini's studio, and he makes this sculpture, which is now called the Angel of the Citadel, which is part of the Peggy legend, there's no doubt, for reasons you can see fairly clearly there. It's actually a very fine sculpture, beautifully finished. He sort of chased the surface. It isn't just a cast piece of bronze. It's got all this work over the surface, which makes it extremely interesting at a, in the best sense, superficial level. But what somebody, a great art historian and the Italian Cultural Institute certainly knows about him, Flavio Fragonzi, spotted in just under his chest, I think here, a little wound. You don't really see it unless you look at it, unless you point out, but I think it's clear that this is a dying warrior, that it was intended at first in Marini's imagination to be a figure who's been struck by a spear. He's about to go down. He changes it, and this would be coherent with Marini's thesis, which was that the horse and rider gradually become separated, that nature and spirit, that man and matter and the world of animals and so on separate slowly in a tragic divide until the whole thing collapses in sculptures that are more or less abstract by the end. This is somewhat before he actually falls from the horse. So it could be in that sequence, instead of which he seems to have converted it into an image of joy, because it was so much fun to meet Peggy, and she was so good for Italian art, and she was going to buy this bronze, and he was going to get a lot of money, and so on. So somehow it became a joyous instead of a tragic image. But I think that's a good thing to know. It's a very fine work of art, and it's been there ever since Peggy put it there in 1949, right after taking possession of the house. In 1950, she holds an exhibition in Venice at the Museo Correr, more specifically in the Ala Napoleonica at the opposite end of St. Mark's. And by putting up her 23 paintings by Jackson Pollock, she had 23 then, only 11 are left, she created the first European, or the first show anywhere outside of America of Jackson Pollock's paintings. And a very important show it was. It was up for about 3 weeks, 10,000 visitors. I once read on a postcard from her. And the reason I've got this comparison with the rather picturesque American pavilion of the Venice Biennale in the middle there is that in that very year, though late, they didn't put anything up until, I think, July or something, but the paintings Peggy was showing from her collection were completely in sync with the Alfred Barr selected paintings in the American pavilion. The ones on the right are Peggy's. One of them already belongs to the Tel Aviv Museum, I think, and the other one, I'm not sure where it went, number 16. But the two on the left were in Alfred Barr's show. This suggests Peggy right in sync with her time. She was chagrined that when she came back to Europe in 1947, losing touch with Pollock, except to the extent that she continued to work for his fame, above all by giving works of art away. She loses the credit for having been the great discoverer of Jackson Pollock. And this annoyed her. People would say, oh, there's a show in Paris in 1952 or something, in a gallery, which was the first show in Europe of Pollock's. Well, it was simply not. This was her great achievement. And she did so. She enjoyed putting up shows, so she takes all her Pollocks and puts them up. And that's the unwitting part of it. She's not intentionally saying, I'm going to make Pollock world famous, though already by this time he was very famous indeed. It's 1949 when Life magazine prints that headline, which goes, Jackson Pollock, is he the greatest living American painter? That was after Peggy had left. And so it all begins to happen after Peggy died. As you saw in 1947, no one would take the mural. if you put the mural on, by Pollock on the market now, you'd easily equal Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, I think. But right after that show in August of 1950, Hans Nemeth is there in Long Island photographing Pollock, and he too contributes importantly to the legend, to the myth of Jackson Pollock. And there is hundreds of photographs and a video, which is well worth seeing if you ever can get a hold of a copy, even though the music is ear-shattering. Peggy was still keen to patronize young artists, and she takes on two Venetians, Tancredi and Bacci. They're not very famous now, but she did her best. Every visitor who came to Venice in the art world, whether it was Alfred Barr or James Johnson Sweeney or anyone you can think of, any art critic who came to the house was forced to buy a Tancredi or a Bacci. I mean, Peggy gave them no choice. Even Tom Messer, who figures importantly later in this story, even Tom Messer said he had to buy a Bacci, otherwise he wouldn't be allowed to leave. A Bacci that he then left to the Guggenheim in New York. Beautiful Tancredi up there. The principle, the rather facile thing to think is that Tancredi looked at Pollock and said, oh, I can do that too. But in fact, his Pollock moment was very brief. There were 3 or 4 paintings which were dripped and experimental, and they're not very good. And he was actually much closer to Lucio Fontana's Spazialismo. It's a kind of variation on the spatialism technique. And I think if you must group him with someone, it would be to the spatialists. Bacci too, perhaps influenced by Kandinsky. His colors, his expressive colors are very similar to those of Kandinsky. Peggy authorized that comparison, even if Tancredi Pollock is not a good nexus in the end. She worked hard to promote them. She was eventually to give up doing exhibitions. It was too hard, much like hard work. She did go on collecting, however, and numerically, there are more paintings bought after 1949 that are in the collection today than there are from her earlier collecting, her incredible collecting sprees in London, Paris, and New York. And those are just some examples. Matta on the top, she bought from her friend, the dealer Carlo Cardazzo. Nice Sam Francis, the white thing in the middle there. Huge Grace Hartigan, would really take up the whole slide if I put it up at scale. Below that, the green Graham Sutherland. And next to that, a little drawing. It was very important in the 1960s. She finally bought some Kupkas. And the Kupkas rival our Picasso Poet for being the oldest works in the collection. They are fundamental, I think, to abstraction and modernism. And the drawings she bought, this one in particular, are sketches for the very first paintings to be put on public display of a purely abstract, or as the Guggenheim would say, non-objective style. Kupka was very, very important. I'm trying to think who, Carl Flinker, she bought them from. So it's just a few drawings. She couldn't really afford art at this point. The market had gone way out of her reach. Then underneath that is Alan Davies. She picked him up, so to speak. I didn't mean that in the way you might think. But she found him. She saw him in an art gallery somewhere in Venice, I think in Campo San Luca or something, a little gallery, and she thought it was really good, partly because I'm sure he reminded her of the early Pollocks that she owned. Davy was at art school then on a scholarship from Edinburgh, and he again goes on and then becomes, when he dies in early this century, to be acclaimed as the greatest modernist painter of Scotland, of his generation. And she took him up. I mean, she always got it right, in my opinion. And on the left is rather obvious, a Vesarelli, which she has. There are many, many post-war purchases, and that's, I'll leave it at that, except for this. In 1960, she was visited by a certain Claire Falkenstein. Claire Falkenstein from San Francisco was taking some members of the San Francisco Museum of Art around Venice, and she called on her friend Peggy, whom she'd known back in New York. And as they left, she and the group, Peggy said, oh, watch out, the doors at the gate here are about to fall off. They might fall on you. And in a spontaneous way, she says, will you make me some new ones? She says, to Claire Falkenstein. Well, Claire, she then got very nervous about it afterwards. She didn't know what's going to cost. But above all, her friend Herbert Reed, still very much a friend, says to her, you know, if you get these open work doors, because she must have been thinking of some gates on a sort of boathouse on a beach near Rome that belonged to Luciana Pignatelli, famous beauty of the 50s. there were gates there. I think they've been destroyed since because they were left out in the open or whatever. But these, she must have known what kind of gates we were talking about. And so Claire sort of coaxes her along, and Herbert Reed says, you know, they're going to put their hand through the wire and open the door from the inside. I mean, so she was rattled into not being enthusiastic. Then she sees two models, chooses one, which she was then in the company of Perry Rathbone from Boston, and so she gave that little model to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And she gives these gates. Now here's the unwitting thing again. These gates were the fulfillment of what Claire Falkenstein was trying to do. She was all interested in outer space, relativity, infinity, and so on. And she wanted to make a work of art which had a never-ending structure. I think that's actually what she called it. It's part of that series. And it was the best fulfillment, I think, that she ever did of that. You see her now in art fairs, but for a while, she almost vanished off the art market completely. Nobody had heard of Claire Falkenstein and so on. She was very good. In the 50s, you know, she was there in Paris. Michel Tapier referred to as one of the group of art autres, which was an important movement in Paris in the 50s. And Peggy sort of did it and so on. And so she has these gates which are still there. Claire Falkenstein came swimming back onto the market thanks to Michael Rosenfeld here in New York, who took her on, so to speak, from a rather feeble foundation in California. In 1964, Peggy visits the Venice Biennale. This was the occasion on which Robert Rauschenberg wins the Grand Prix. And the reason for this slide is that it sort of marks the end of Peggy's collecting, at least in terms of in art historical terms. She considered pop art the enemy, which of course it was, if you were really loyal to abstract expressionism. It was all the things that abstract expression was not. It was facile, it was cool instead of hot, it was superficial, it was appropriation and so on. So she resented that, and she resented also the sheer prices that were being asked. When a young artist like Robert Rauschenberg in 1962-63 was getting $80,000, $100,000 for his works of art, when she had bargained down the owner of her Poet by Picasso to $4,400 back in 1942, she just realized that she couldn't really collect seriously. She would buy little things or cheap things after that. The mayor, who stands in the background on the right, I'm sorry, but to the right in the left-hand image, behind Robert Rauschenberg, looking so dapper and youthful, and in between Peggy and Minister Gui, Luigi Gui, rather displeasing anagrammatical sort of name, Minister Luigi Gui greeting her at the American Pavilion. And what you see there is actually historically interesting. The tubing from the lean-to, or the patio, which had been, the covering for the patio of the American Pavilion, which had enabled Robert Rauschenberg's pictures to be moved there at the last minute before the prize giving. 2 years earlier, that same mayor that I pointed out just now had offered Peggy honorary citizenship. Now, I know from having one honorary citizenship in a much more minor town than Venice, that they are completely useless. I mean, you don't get bus passes or anything. Honorary citizenships are purely honorific. And it's all right, you get a scroll. But they'd given her this to her for a specific purpose, which was to try and inveigle her to leave her collection in Venice. And that became the big issue in the 60s. In the late 50s, there were scandals of one kind or another. Peggy's going to do this, Peggy's going to do that. But by the 60s, Peggy was really beginning to be concerned about the posthumous life of her collection. There she is with San Tommaso, whom I mentioned before. Next to her, bearded, is Emilio Vedova. Giuseppe Marchiori, corpulent in the foreground, was the one who curated her 49 exhibition with her of sculpture. And then Giovanni Comiso is a poet well known to Italianists. So the Italians really started to think they needed to keep this collection. And here's the story. This is going to take me a few minutes. In 1949, Peggy, after the Venice Biennale, was worried about the customs dues on her collection. It had been imported by the Biennale, but temporarily. If she wanted to take it out of the country, if she wanted to leave it in Venice, she had to pay permanent duties instead of being exempted because it was temporary. And she didn't want to do this. She said, well, I'll offer it, I'll give it to Venice if the state in Rome will let me off the taxes. And for 2 years, from 47 to 49, they wrestled over it. I'm sorry, from 49 to 51, because in the spring of 51, finally, the ministries in Rome said no, no, and no again to the exemption from tax. And they were persuaded by people like the guy up on the left, Mr. Florestano di Fausto, from those of you who know Italian, interparlanza in the Italian parliament in 49. And he attacked the Biennale. He called it a Luna Park sideshow, a baraccone. And he refers to Peggy's collection as a sconcia raccolta. If any of you are Italian, you'll help me translate sconcia, but it's not very easy. It means something like indecent, grubby, something like that, a sconcia raccolta. So he abused the collection. He said, why is the Biennale being so stupid as to pay the insurance and the airfare for this collection to Italy when our own frescoes and altarpieces in the churches are all degrading and falling apart? So there's this clear hostility to contemporary art, to the Biennale, in official governmental levels. And that's why I put J.B. Manson up there in the middle, because he, exactly 10 years earlier, had the same opinion about, actually slightly more, about Peggy's collection. So Peggy's collection is up for grabs, you might say, or at least it was in the perception of many others. Peggy had written to her uncle in 1959 at the time, and actually she'd spoken to him, I think, at the time of the opening of the Guggenheim Museum in New York here. And she said to him, would you like the collection? And Harry Guggenheim, by then president of the Guggenheim, said, no, Peggy, I think the best place for it is Italy. So he sort of turned it down. Then in '64, Peggy writes to Harry Guggenheim again, are you sure you wouldn't like to run my museum in Venice? So she was clearly thinking in those terms. But meanwhile, others had their eyes on it. Norton Simon great crashes a party, then comes to lunch with her the day after and says, would you consider giving your collection to the University of California? I think Berkeley in particular. Peggy said, well, that would be a delightful idea. Well, I'd be happy to do that, but you must save Venice in the meantime, on the condition that you save Venice. So she never saw him again. She was already in trattativa, to use the Italian phrase, with the Tate Gallery. Now, she really loved England. She'd had lovers there. The great lover of her life, John Holmes, was English, and others too. Norman Reed was wooing her. It's actually, there's an article called The Charm Offensive of the Tate Gallery. They offered her to show her collection. They restored the paintings. They catalogued it. They gave her a swell dinner in the galleries at the Tate, and they were sure they could get it. And Peggy was emotionally keen to do that. But she was also rather sure that really it belonged in Venice. And friends of hers like Giuseppe Santomaso, like her first husband Lawrence Vail, with whom she was on very good terms still, said, no, Peggy, the collection stays here. So that was her really, deep down, her program. The Tate gets disappointed and they never really knew why. And I suspect it was because the Italian government started to make trouble. They said, did she really pay those importation duties in 1951? Is it really correctly imported? This is typical of ministries of culture. I've been through it myself with a Van Gogh, which the Guggenheim once owned. But they make trouble, and they're on the margins of legitimacy. They exert power, and clearly there were great difficulties ahead. Somebody else got a clearance from the American tax authorities that this would be all right if she sent it to London, and so forth. So it just doesn't happen. It sort of malingers even after the success of the show. Meanwhile, the Guggenheim, under new leadership, the new leadership of Tom Messer, as well as Harry Guggenheim, decided that they should really embark on a campaign. They really wanted the collection to come to America, as I've said, with its Pollocks and its Surrealists and many other things, even the Mondrians. It would have been an amazing reinforcement of the permanent collection of the Guggenheim here. But she eventually says, no, nope, it has to stay in Venice. And if you want it, you have to manage it in Venice. And they come to terms in 1976, and the collection passes to the Guggenheim Foundation, even before Peggy dies, which she does 3 years later, having had the usufrutto of the collection for the rest of her life. And I think that brings us, there's the show that the Guggenheim gave her. Peggy didn't like the building. She called it Uncle Sol's garage when she when she went to the opening in 1959, and she said the collection looks awful. It looks like postage stamps on the walls and so on. But it is slightly oniric to see these Peggy paintings so lodged in the Venetian psyche, hanging in Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, and they do look quite small. So that brings us back to the Palazzo as it is now. There we are. And that, I think, I've kept you much longer than I meant to. I haven't looked at my watch, but anyway. Thank you very much, everybody.